Welcome to Tapping Wisdom. I'm Dr. Sue Paternack, and I'm so delighted to welcome my friend and colleague and occasional mentor, Dr. Anita Polite-Wilson. Dr. Anita, as she likes to call herself with her audience and with her clients, has been a friend for a number of years. We met actually during the COVID-19 pandemic on Zoom, when I had decided after the murder of George Floyd to conduct a session on breaking the discomfort of talking about race at an Executive Next Practices conference. Thank you to Scott Hamilton. Shout out to you. While I was leaning into that, I was also quite terrified. Dr. Anita was an incredible mentor, supporter, and we became fast friends. The combination of all of the people headed up by Dr. Anita in the community really helped me make that session pretty successful and helpful to a lot of people who were also struggling with the same things that I was struggling with. So thank you. I will always be grateful to you for that, Anita. And so since then, it took about a year for us to meet in person in 2021 because of the pandemic. But after a big hug, we've been fast friends, and I've been fascinated by Dr. Anita's perspective on diversity, equity, and inclusion because of her emphasis on the notion of belonging, which one could perceive as an extension or a part of inclusion, but it really is different. So I invited Dr. Anita to talk with us about creating a culture of belonging from a leadership perspective. So what does that mean? How do you do it? How do you know you've arrived, or as a work in process, and other tips that she might want to share with us. So welcome, Dr. Anita, my friend. I'm wondering if you could just further introduce yourself to our audience and tell us a bit about your interest in the work of belonging for leaders.
Well, first of all, Dr. Sue, it's so good to see you. Again, welcome to the community of doctors. It's about time you got here. We've been waiting for you. And before you even had your degree, you were doing amazing things in the space. I know that you're going to continue to do that. So congratulations again, and thank you so much for having me. We are definitely fast, dear friends, and you bring as much to my life as you do to anybody else's. So thank you just for your friendship. It's a gift.
Thank you. Back at you.
So about me, I am the founder and CEO of Dr. Anita Enterprises Incorporated. And in my role, I am a C-suite trusted advisor. I'm a board director, and I'm a diversity, inclusion, and belonging strategy consultant. And primarily, I help C-suite leaders and their teams reframe diversity conversations from difficult to different. And that is one of my key differentiators. A lot of people assume that these conversations have to be difficult, hence why you did your amazing presentation for ENP. But it's really about making sure that we understand these conversations are different. They're not necessarily hard, but they're definitely complex. And with complexity requires thoughtfulness, reflection, and really meeting people where they are. We need to make sure that we are not continuing to promote shame and blame, but that we are inviting people in to know and grow. Mm-hmm. And in my work, my approach is never proving that my message is right, but the onus is upon me to make sure that my message is received. And so if people can receive my message, then over time, after reflection, they will come to the rightness of it in terms of not focusing on race relations, but focusing on real relationships that will then address race relations. So in a nutshell, that's my approach. That's why I exist. And I love working with the clients that I work with. I am also a faculty member for Duke Corporate Education. And so they will have corporate clients that may be having their executive teams develop, and they will ask me to come in and do some diversity work. I'm also often a guest speaker for Vanderbilt University, very excited about that. And I'm looking at another Ivy League college to collaborate with. I won't share right now because we're still in talks, but I'm very excited about the possibilities of that. I'm also a public speaker. I'm an author. I've got several books behind me, and I have a podcast, and that is called Keeping It Real with Dr. Anita. And this month in October, we're focusing on my annual look at what's scary about diversity, inclusion, and belonging. And this time I have a panel of diverse experts in different fields and different capacities talking about that. So if your community is interested, they can find me on LinkedIn at Anita Polite-Wilson, PhD. And if you connect with me, then you will be notified every Saturday of my most recent podcast.
Fantastic. So let's talk about kind of the origin story. How did you become interested in doing this work, particularly as it relates to, you know, your frame of reference on belonging? Because there's such a unique voice to that and such a unique perspective, particularly as it relates to working with leaders.
Well, obviously, being a woman of color all my life, it's always been a challenge to feel a sense of belonging. And so there's a saying in the community that you have to do twice as much to get half as far. And I have found that to be the case. So having earned a BS, 2 masters, and a PhD, I have found in my personal journey that education has been the great equalizer, because even though I'm still the same person with the same knowledge and same experiences, there's something about those 3 little letters at the end of my name that cause people to be more readily accepting of even listening to me, let alone partnering with me. And so that has made a difference. And so when I thought about my journey, belonging is huge because, as it's been said, and I'm sure you've heard this, diversity, inclusion, belonging is being invited to the party. That's diversity. Inclusion is being asked to dance, but belonging is being invited to pick the music. And we can interpret that several different ways. But for me, belonging really is, what does it look like? What does it feel like? What does it sound like? What does it act like? Unless we can identify and put a name on belonging, it's hard for us to know whether or not we've been able to attain belonging. And so that's one of the things that I focus on with my clients, and I have exercises around that. I'm not telling you what it is. You're identifying for yourself and for your team what belonging means and what it looks like. And when people have clarity around what it is they're trying to define, then it's easier to see whether or not we've made it or whether or not we've still got some work to do. And there's always going to be work to do. The whole process of belonging is not a one and done. It's something that has to always be thought about. Just like the development of any type of significant relationship, we're always practicing and thinking about and demonstrating what is belonging in this relationship, either for the person I'm in relationship with or for me being the other party in the relationship.
So I find it fascinating that you work with your clients to help to facilitate a process where they discover what belonging means for them personally as well as organizationally in their culture. I'm wondering if you've let's go the kind of the converse. I'm wondering if you've seen patterns in organizations when there hasn't been belonging. What are some of the common themes that probably have prompted them to bring you in, you know, to help them?
One of the most troubling themes that I've seen is the promotion of toxic rock stars. These are people in the organization at any level that make great numbers, but they leave untold collateral damage in their wake. And when you think about weighing out the cost, they're just not worth it to have in the organization. And yet somehow they still manage to be there. They manage to get promoted up. And it just boggles my mind that toxic rock stars are still allowed to exist. They either know they have a problem and don't care, or people are too scared to tell them they have a problem. And this is where feedback is a gift. And too often we say, well, it's either negative feedback or positive feedback. Feedback is what it is. There may be opportunities for constructive feedback instead of negative. And there are always opportunities to share positive or encouraging feedback. We've also heard feedback versus feed forward. Well, based on your previous performance, this is the feedback that I have for you. Moving forward, this is the feed forward that I have for you in order to change that. So that's the first thing. The second thing is there is an opportunity to make sure that people are open to having conversations, whether they be difficult or otherwise, what people's attitudes are toward risk and failure. Is risk and failure seen as a learning opportunity, or is it an opportunity to demean people? Then we need to talk about people's willingness to help. And oftentimes it's not really a willingness, but it's a matter of capacity or ability. Do I have the actual capacity to help you? And if I do I have the ability to help you in the way that you need to help? And then finally, there's diversity. And of course, we're talking about diversity in terms of how people present, race, gender, religious background, neurodiversity, intellectual disability, and all of those other things that we can define under diversity. But there's also, as I've recently discovered with a client, we need to focus on diversity in terms of leadership. How long have you been in leadership? How long have you been at this particular executive level? How long have you been doing things that got you here, but won't necessarily get you there? And what's your willingness to change and do what it takes now in a new environment, in a new position, so on and so forth. So those are some of the challenges that I find. And in particular, when I work with C-suite teams, I encourage them, I need you to take off your executive title and just show up as people. And let's talk about what your lived experiences have been. Let's look at what's common. Let's look at what's different. And let's look at how we can embrace each other as whole people. And once we can get the C-suite team to understand what belonging is, then it's easier to cascade that down and really begin to demonstrate inclusive leadership traits of everyone. And that also includes diversity. And what I find troubling is, since the Supreme Court decision about college campuses,
Yes.
that a lot of corporations seem to have the position of, oh, we don't have to do this anymore. We're just prohibited by law, or they're either renaming chief diversity officers to a completely different title, or they're eliminating the position altogether. So those are the things that I find challenging and troubling, but those are also my opportunities to come in and help people become comfortable with the discomfort that comes when their awareness is raised as we walk through this journey together.
I want to come back to that. So I've made a note of it because I think that's really critically important to talk about. I did also make a note. It's funny you mentioned the Marshall Goldsmith book, "What Got You Here Won't Get You There," right? I was actually thinking the same thing when you talked about the toxic rock stars. One of Marshall Goldsmith's elements of that is, well, this is just me. I've always been this way. This is what got me here. This is why I'm so successful. Just deal with it. Right. Yeah. And because they've been successful, they intimidate the people around them. So there's a strange codependency. Right. So it sounds to me like your work is to help to make the business case, right? Because that's the only case that is presenting, right? That's actually not serving the organization in the long term, right? That it's almost clogging things up like cholesterol in a system. But they're not really seeing it that way, right? They're still seeing that the blood is flowing. So right. Can you talk a little bit about that, like the business case for kind of dealing with those toxic rock stars at the leadership level, and helping to at least create an awareness and an acknowledgement, before they even kind of do anything about it, right? So talk about that a little bit, because I think that is on the minds of a lot of people.
It's interesting that you use the term business case, because someone I consider a mentor, Mr. Michael C. Bush, which is the CEO of Great Place to Work, he was on a podcast earlier this year and we talked about that. And he said, we talk a lot about business cases. He said, but honestly, leaders, if they get an idea in their mind, you can bring them a business case all day long as to why or why not, but they're going to do what they want to do. And so in my work, I have seen the same is true. I can identify a toxic rock star. I can give them, the business case. It's lowering morale, which is lowering, employee engagement, which is lowering performance, which is eventually going to lower your profit margin. And they don't care for whatever reason. And as a matter of fact, I just had a conversation today and yesterday with two different clients who are dealing with toxic rock stars that the organization allows to exist. And so when you ask me about the business case, it's really about raising the awareness and then asking the client, what's more important to you? Is getting the numbers really that important to you in the short term? or is having leaders that are going to cultivate teams that will get you numbers, sustainable numbers in the long term, more important. And oftentimes there's some kind of personal factor in there that we don't know about that really has nothing to do with the business. And so one of the books that I've written, Corporate Toxicity, talks about 3 Mile Island and the fact that there's an indicator that let folks know if they were paying attention that there was a problem. And I pose that executives at the top know that there's a problem. They know who their toxic rock stars are, but for whatever reason, they choose not to deal with them. And so this book goes into that and the whole notion of psychological safety. And the acronym for safety is security, autonomy, fairness, esteem, trust, and you. I may not have it in the correct order, but those are what the letters stand for. And when we think about what people need to feel secure and safe, this is how corporate toxicity is allowed to take root and how toxic rock stars are allowed to run rampant because we're not paying attention to what it takes to create a psychologically safe environment where everyone can thrive, and a psychologically safe environment that says, because this is what your behavior is not aligned with what we deem as a psychological safe organization, you cannot remain here. We're going to have to invite you to be successful elsewhere.
That's really brilliant. Thank you for sharing that. It reminds me in the negotiation world when we say, you know, when things don't make sense, they're not about sense.
That's right.
So we talk about, you know, so it's really about the interests, the underlying motives that are the silent movers of behavior. So it sounds a lot like what you're talking about, and because it really is the antithesis of belonging, right? You know, it's the toxic rock stars are the people, they feel like they belong, but you know, everybody else is just at their mercy.
And that's the thing.
Yeah.
They feel like they belong, but they also know that they're out of place. They know that they're out of place. I've had them come to me, and you know, as a consultant, sometimes you have to have your spidey sense going, right? When someone's having a conversation with you and you feel like they're telling you just enough to sway you to their side. But because we are trained to listen to what's not being said, we're trained to read between the lines. We know that they know that they're the problem. And part of them wants to face it just enough to stay out of hot water. But they don't really want to change because, to your point about Marshall Goldsmith's book, being this way has got me to this point of success, and I have no incentive to change. And it's really a shame because not only does it damage the people that they lead, which eventually damages the organization, they're really doing themselves no favors in the long run.
Yeah. And then chances are they're not walking through the doors, virtual or real, and just suddenly changing. They're like that in their personal lives as well.
That's right.
So yeah, so it's a personal style. Right?
It's a matter of integrity.
Yeah, exactly.
Integrity.
So I also wanted to, you know, to come back to some of the work that you talked about in terms of inclusive leadership traits, right? So let's say that some of that awareness, whether or not there's a toxic rock star or not, you know, what are some of those inclusive leadership traits that foster a culture of belonging in some of the client work that you've done? What are you seeing?
One of the things I like to focus on is cultural awareness. And now when we're talking about cultural awareness, again, we're not necessarily talking about how people represent their gender, their race, their ethnicity, their neurodiversity, whatever disabilities they may have. I'm actually also talking about subcultures in the organization. Are you aware of the subculture of executives, of executive assistants, of engineers, of sales, of training and development, of the facilities team? Unless we're aware of the cultures, not only of individuals, but also of the subcultures in our organization, we're doing ourselves a great disservice. A lot of my work really focuses on raising people's awareness, because unless we're aware of things, we can't possibly make different choices that really improve and enhance our interpersonal relationships. And really, work gets done through relationships if we think about it. So I really focus on belonging and awareness. And one of the focuses of inclusive leadership is cultural awareness in all its forms and facets.
What that triggered in my mind is all of the complaints, Anita, that people talk about with silos in organizations. You and I have been around for a few years, and how long have we been hearing people complain about there being stovepipes in organizations, right? Always, and it preceded us.
Yeah.
So that's what that sounds like to me. That's kind of a core point of intervention. That there, because of course there are subcultures throughout. There can be an organizational culture, say in Apple, right, or or Google, but there are of course subcultures throughout those organizations. So breaking down those silos comes first with those cultural awareness insights that we have about how different groups are going to have different priorities and different ways of doing things, etc. So let's talk a bit about how that connects to creating a culture of belonging.
Well, I get there by challenging organizations to think about the BS that inhibits belonging in the workplace. Yeah, and when I say that, I usually get that reaction like, did she really say BS? I'm like, yes, I did. And then I go on to define for them, well, let's unpack this. BS in terms of our personal backstories, BS in terms of the bad stories that we've heard about groups of people that we have no personal foundation to refute or to validate. And then our blind spots that all feed into the organizational belief system. So when I talk about looking at the BS that inhibits workplace belonging, it's people's backstories, bad stories that they've heard, blind spots, all of which feed into the organizational belief system. So for example, one of my backstories is when I was in the second grade, my white female teacher tried to tell my parents that I probably wasn't smart enough to be in her class. And unbeknownst to her, my mother was an English teacher. She was very well connected in the district. She taught regular English. She taught honors English. She was on the yearbook committee. She was on several other different committees. And so my mother, being very gracious, and for some reason, when I talk with other colleagues, it seemed to be in the second grade that children of color, Black and brown children, their parents were often told this story. And because at the time, white women were seen as the authority figure, unless they had parents like mine that said, okay, we'll take this with a grain of salt. We raised our daughter. We know that she's precocious, but we'll go ahead and take her tested. And in this instance, the second grade teacher who said I wasn't smart enough to be in her class was right, but not for the reason she thought. I belonged in the GATE program, which was education.
Too smart,
right?
Too smart for her class.
But that backstory over the years always had a tape playing in my head that I wasn't smart enough, I wasn't smart enough, I wasn't smart enough, which drove me to get my bachelor's and my first master's and my second master's and my PhD. But after a while, that story, if it ever really served me, other than to push me to prove to this voice in my head that I was smart enough, after a while, it didn't serve me anymore. Now, if I had let that backstory color my interactions with all white women, what kind of relationships would I have missed out on? Yours and mine included. There's also the bad story that says angry Black woman is dangerous. Well, what about the fact that we can be justified to be angry about the injustice that we face in the workplace? And that doesn't mean that we're running around going postal, so to speak, as the term of the day used to be, right? Well, that's a bad story that some people believe, but yet have never experienced me when I'm angry. So why would you believe a bad story that Black women are the angry Black woman? Or why would you believe the bad story that only successful Black women can excel in sports and entertainment? Why would you believe that when I'm right here? So too often we're willing to believe bad stories that we have no personal basis of evidence in to say, yes, that's right.
Well, stereotypes, right?
Exactly.
Their prejudices, yeah.
And then the blind spots would be applying your personal experience to me. I was one time coaching an executive. He happened to be Indian American, and he was sharing his story about how growing up as a child, when he was, early 12, 13, he had to go to work to help support the family. And he said, I'm sure you had the same experience. I said, no, I did not. My parents met in college. They married. My father was in the military for 4 years. He served in the Air Force. They both had college degrees. They were raising us together in the home. We had access to anything we wanted to share. So just because you as a person of color had this experience where you had to go to work at 12, don't assume that I had the same experience. Don't assume that I didn't have the opportunity to study the arts and sciences, go to ballet, have family trips to the theater. Don't assume that I didn't have those opportunities in what we consider the American lifestyle, because that wasn't your case. So again, when we unpack our bad stories and whether or not we allow those bad stories to color all of our future interactions with someone who happened to look like that, whether or not we believe in bad stories about a group of folks that we have no personal basis for, and whether or not we are applying blind spots to other people based on our lived experience, all of those things shape the organizational belief system, because organizations are made up of people. So if people are coming to the table with all of these things, these assumptions, interpretations, and limiting beliefs that they place on others, what is the organizational belief system saying to everyone else?
And we do, you can't trust who you don't know, right? We know that.
Exactly.
So that comes all the way back to your original point, where this is about building relationships, right? And what does that mean? So
and Sue, to your point about not trusting what we don't know, our brain is conditioned to protect us.
yes.
And so anything that is not familiar to us, we automatically label that as dangerous until we have a sense of knowing something different. And so we've somehow got to break that pattern to say, well, in this situation, a white woman hurt me, but this is a different situation and a different white woman, and I cannot assume that she's going to hurt me as well. So what do we do? How do we recondition ourselves to be safe, but to assume best intent? And that's a whole different discussion, because I've talked to lots of women of color that say in the workplace, I can't assume best intent because everybody's always gunning for me simply because I'm a Black woman. So back to my original statement about my work and helping C-suite leaders and their teams reframe diversity conversations from difficult to different and from hard to complex. This work is complex because we're dealing with human beings who are complex. And so there is no one right way of doing this, but the best way of doing it is, again, not to call people out for what they've done, but call people into new knowledge, to help people become comfortable with the discomfort that comes when our awareness is raised. And again, that discomfort is not to shame and blame you, it's to trigger you to say, I've been thinking a bad story about Black women that in my personal experience isn't true. So why am I doing that? Where is that coming from? And what can I do to stop that behavior? What can I do to start a different behavior? What can I do more of in terms of having these relationships, these rich relationships? And what can I do less of that's getting in my own way?
Those are really important things to do from a leadership perspective. I love your concept of not calling people out, but calling people in, because I think you're right. People don't make the distinction between, and I bring this back from my training days, the difference between their intent versus their impact.
Yes.
Right? People see the world through their intentions, and other people see us through our impact. And so bringing the intent out, right, is about self-compassion, self-understanding, and self-expression, and getting the feedback about the impact, right, are important places of intervention, so we can start to see where we are misaligned in ourselves. And people forget to do that, with giving,
we're not conditioned.
with giving feedback. People are so focused on the outcome and the impact, they and then when people don't feel seen or heard and acknowledged, they feel they've been treated unfairly, which kind of self-perpetuates that, well, this is just me, and I'm still rocking it out with results, so deal with it because you're not seeing me. So I think your point is beautiful, because when people feel heard and seen and understood and respected, that all, and we talked about an article just recently from the APA about mattering and feeling like we matter. Those all contribute to a sense of belonging and aligning our intent with our impact and owning it if we're off, right?
Yes.
And being able to adjust more nimbly because we're, to be able to adjust and admit isn't a threat. Right? It's okay. We're all human. We all make mistakes and we're all off. And to get acknowledged, I love your encouraging feedback, right? And remembering as leaders to give people encouraging, positive feedback. So people, again, in that way, feel seen too when things are going well.
A couple other stories I wanted to mention about impact. Years ago, I was working as an apprentice, so to speak, to a gentleman who's very strong in this field. And he told a story that at first I was like, you couldn't find a better example, but he said, in terms of demonstrating the whole concept of impact with intent, if I were to say, Sue, if you were walking across the parking lot and I accidentally ran over you and you were no longer with us, my intention was not that. It was a complete accident. Or if you were walking across the parking lot, you said something that did not sit well with me and I ran over you, you're still not with us. In that instance, the intention doesn't matter because the impact is you're no longer with us. And so when someone says something that's hurtful, even though that's not their intention, the impact is still here. And there have been case studies that say that psychologically, I can't think of the word I'm trying to use right now, but hurts that are psychological are just as impactful as hurts that are physical.
Oh, pain, right? The psychological pain. Yes,
That's
I've
it.
seen
That's
those
it.
study too. Yeah.
And even though physically a scar may fade away over time, we don't know what that emotional, psychological impact has over a wound. And then the other thing I'll say is this: the last time you and I saw each other at an ENP event recently, a gentleman came up to me afterwards. He was white, and he said, I want to ask you some questions, and I'm not quite sure how to pose it. So my intention is da-da-da-da-da-da. I was so open to that. I was so open to that because he told me up front, I'm not quite sure how to phrase this. My intention is not to hurt you. I want to ask questions out of curiosity. And we had a lovely conversation. So those are the two things that I wish people would remember in terms of intent with impact. And again, I thought it was a very grotesque example, but it's true. Whether the intention is accidental or to hurt someone, if you run over someone, they're dead. And if your intention is, I want to say something, but I'm not quite sure how to phrase it, and if I don't get it right, will you please help me to understand what I did wrong? Who can argue with that? Who can have a problem with someone who's being sincere and transparent and authentic about that?
And that really, nuances what we mean by intent versus impact, right? So the good news is that in organizational settings, they're going to be more like your recent experience than the massive one. But I think your point is well taken, though, because not all impacts are forgiving of intent.
That's right.
Regardless. And so that's where some thought needs to be put into it. Obvious, there are going to be obvious ones like this one. But there might be situations, especially when there are ethical breaches.
Yes.
Right. Or that's where my mind went, is like, where would there be such a violation that intent wouldn't matter, and probably some sort of ethical breach would be an example of that. So before we kind of do our concluding thing, I want to ask, when we walk into organizations, how do we know it when when they have a culture of belonging? What are we hearing? What are we seeing? What are the common themes? What are people feeling? Those kinds of things.
I remember when I was going in for eye surgery, I had LASIK done, and I noticed the office. It's all people of color. The doctor and the owner of the organization is a Black male. And I was just noticing that there was one guy in the office. So I was asking the young lady who was helping me, she was examining my eyes. She happened to be Asian American. I said, so what's it like around here? She said, honestly, I could probably work somewhere else. But when I think about other places where I have been and where I am now, she said this, I didn't. She said, there's such a sense of belonging here that I wouldn't want to leave. So the gentleman came in and he escorted me to my next room. I said, okay, you're the only guy here. Do you ever feel like the odd man out? He said, no, I always feel a sense of belonging. You can feel it because they will say it, and there's no question about it. And this organization has such high, excellent standards that it kind of turns the myth on its head that, and this is an old saying, that white is right. Anybody who's empowered, educated, equipped, effective, that's the person to go with. And none of this right here matters. But we have to be open to seeing leadership is not just this, leadership can also be this. Leadership is not just always a 6'4" white male with blue eyes, but leadership is always someone that looks like, is also someone that looks like Dr. Sue or Dr. Nita or anybody else that you can think of that's not a 6'4" white male with blue eyes, right?
Yeah.
And we have to get accustomed to that, because by the year 2050, I've done the research, leadership is going to change, even at the C-suite level. So we need to get accustomed to it.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And yeah, and I think of all of the companies that I worked for where it felt like a family, where when people talked about it feeling like a family. I know there are some issues with that because obviously it's an organization and
There are.
right.
Yeah.
But I think the sentiment behind that has that sense of belonging that you're talking about. So I think belonging is much healthier.
It is.
Way of thinking about an organizational culture versus feeling like it's a family, because with a family, obviously we're entitled to each other, right? There's a different kind of bond there, right? That is a forever, and there's a little bit more contingency in organizations, and that's just reality on both sides, right? On both sides. It still needs to be earned. You could say the same thing about families too, by the way. That's a different conversation for a different show.
It is. But I'm thinking you and my very good friend, Jerry Gonzalez, you could do a road show together, because I still tend to use the word family. He hates family in terms of organizations for the exact same reasons that you just mentioned. But if we think about a sense of family or a sense of community, and really in the workplace, whether we're, meeting on site or whether we're, we've got our remote locations, we're with our work folks more than they are with family. So perhaps if we tried to soften the interactions a little bit and be a little more considerate, it would go a long way in the organization.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And I love the term community and community of belonging.
Yeah.
So let me ask a couple of closing questions. So first of all, what have I not asked that would be helpful for people to know, or that you would like to share?
It's interesting. This conversation has just been so timely, because almost everything we've talked about, I've had conversations similar to within the past month. I don't think you asked me anything that is not out there. I'm thinking of the Ncline group. It was a political show years ago. And the host would always say, tell me something I don't know. And I think perhaps you know this, but maybe your guests don't. The strides that we think we may have made since George Floyd's murder, they've not been sustained. I had mentioned at the top of the show the fact that even the title Chief Diversity Officer, that title is going away, if not the whole role. We still have work to do. And I think something else that your viewers may or may not be aware of, and if they are aware of it, it still bears repeating. When we talk about diversity, inclusion, and belonging, it is not a 3 to 5 year initiative. It must be embedded into the operations of the organization. And the analogy that I use a lot is, if I needed a life-saving blood transfusion to save my life, in 5 years, that blood, that life-saving blood, is not going to drain out my pinky toe, is going to be in my body for the rest of my life. Similarly, when we are on the journey of diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, it cannot be a 3 to 5 year initiative. It must be something that is embedded into the DNA of an organization, especially since by 2050, organizations are going to be very, very different. And if you don't get on board If you don't invest in all of the talent in your organization, you're literally leaving money on the table because you've got people coming in, they're not engaged, they're not effective. You can't sustain a good workforce that way. And a workforce that can't be sustained is a workforce that cannot meet bottom line profits.
Thank you so much. And thank you for bringing back the kind of the macro environment in which we're in. So if we could summarize, and this is going to be hard, what are kind of three, four, five like main takeaways do you think that our listeners can go, okay, these are insights or actionable things that I can do right away?
Three things that I always encourage folks to do is invite participation, have conversations, investigate perceptions. Based on your life experience, what do you see and how do you perceive the rest of the world? And then integrate perspectives. Your perspective is based on your lived experience, but in order to have a well-rounded worldview, you need to integrate the perspective of other folks. I did not say that you need to necessarily reach agreement, but by inviting participation, by investigating perceptions, and by integrating perspectives, you will definitely raise your awareness.
Thank you so much. Invite, investigate,
participation, yep.
And integrate, the three I's.
That's right. That's right.
Brilliant. Brilliant. And Anita, how can people find you, if they're interested in more?
My website is dranita.com. You need to spell out the word doctor, doctoranita.com. If you'd like to reach me to book a conversation, you can type in admin, ADMIN, at dranita.com. And I would love it if you connect with me on LinkedIn, Anita Polite-Wilson, PhD. I'm actually the only Anita Polite-Wilson in there. But if you connect with me on LinkedIn, then you will automatically get notifications of my Saturday podcast. And it's called Keeping It Real with Dr. Anita.
Absolutely. Dr. Anita, thank you so much for your wisdom, your insights. And I'm so happy to belong to part of your community.
Dr. Sue, it's been a pleasure. Thank you for inviting me. And anytime we can tap into one another's wisdom. It's been a great conversation. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you. This has been Tapping Wisdom. I'm Sue Paternak.